Time, and we don't want to hear growling stomachs in the middle of the presentation. So I'm excited to be moderating this panel. My name is Sarah Lee Whitson. I'm the executive director of DAWN. The topic of our panel today is Lessons Learned, Arab Spring Uprisings and Failed Transitions. I should say hard lessons learned, and I don't know how much we've learned, but I guess we'll find out. In the interests of time, I am not going to introduce the speakers with their full bios, but refer you to the excellent program that has that information to maximize the time available for our speakers given our late start. But I am going to say a little bit more about Dr. Rahim, since I think she's less well known in this circle and has come a very long way. So our first speaker is Dr. Abdelmogoud Darderi, my dear friend for many years, but more importantly, the former spokesperson of the FRC of Egypt's Freedom and Justice Party, a longtime activist for human rights and democracy in Egypt, unwavering in his commitment, and very eager to hear his remarks. We are going to try to keep each of these remarks to 10 minutes, but the speakers' presentations are a bit longer, so excuse us if there's any little kerfuffles at the end.
Thank you, Sarah. Just 1 minute. Good morning, everyone. I'm really happy to be here with you, and I'm really thankful to CSID for choosing not only the conference, but the title of the conference, The Denial of Democracy. Denying democracy to a free people that demand bread, freedom, and rule of law is dehumanizing. Today, we all stand witness to how dehumanizing a people allows the world witness a genocide and stand watch. It's all connected. As I begin to discuss lessons, hard lessons learned from the denial of democracy, I want to honor my colleagues who believed in the idea of democracy and were elected in the free and fair elections, one of the most fair elections in the history of Egypt. And I will be playing the video of more than 100 members of parliament in Egypt who have been in jail for the past 10 years. And they're still in jail. Some of them died due to medical negligence. Others died because of the torture. Others died for different reasons, but the majority of them, over 92 members of parliament, are still in jail until today. Would you please play the video? The video will be coming. You don't need to look at me. Please look at those and look at their eyes and listen to their demands for justice, because their only crime was they believed in democracy. And they believed that democracy will be able to solve the challenges that Egypt was facing at that time and still face us today. There are more than 60,000 political prisoners. This is just one segment of the political prisoners who are in jail in Egypt today. Among those 60,000, 92 members of parliament are still alive. About 21 died either in jail or right after they came out of jail. 4 of members of parliament died in exile. And you cannot imagine when people die in exile away from their family, it leaves a terrible impact on the families as well as in the people themselves. So whether or not you agree with their politics or with their person, what I do know is that these individuals represented the exercise of democratic process played out, and with democracy denied, their imprisonment is a microcosm of the human toll it took on all Egyptians. As I speak, photos of the elected members of parliament, my colleagues, will be displayed in efforts to remind us all that they are not merely numbers. It's also not lost on me that many of the photos are of poor quality, but that too is a representative of the suffocation of space and communication and the inability to attain safely something as simple as a high-quality photos. Please keep running the video as long as I'm speaking. The Arab uprisings were the most necessary response to the post-colonial failure of the Arab states, local, regional, and international, to seize that historical moment was the worst democratic loss in the Arab world. Based on lessons learned from the failure to promote democracy, I argue that unless indigenous democratic transitions take place, new colonial powers will continue to rule in Egypt as well as in other parts in the Arab world, and violations of human rights, of human, political, economic, and legal rights will continue to thrive. The violent hold to democracy was executed by the post-colonial military junta and supported by the illiberal liberals, regional authoritarian regimes, and the complicity of the international community, including officials and institutions from Europe and the United States of America. Since the military coup, it is reported that more than 897 political prisoners have died in prison due to torture and medical negligence. Many of the youth in Egypt today are either in jail or in exile. Demoralization is at a high time, is at an all-high time, causing many to flee the country or restore to substance abuse or extremist ideas. Politically, Egypt has come to be one of the worst police states in the region. The draconian approach to quash political opposition has become an expected norm that diminishes any possibility of a peaceful democratic transition. Since the military coup, all sitting members of parliament must be selected and or approved by the security apparatus, pushing the reality of democratic process further away. Since I participated in the free and fair election until today, from 2013 until 2024, we have not seen a free and fair democratic process on all levels. On the municipal level, it is not happening. On the national level, as parliament, it is selected by the police apparatus. And on the presidential level, there is only one man running, and we call this man who is going to restore democracy. When President Morsi, the democratically elected president, was kidnapped by the military, which constituted a dark moment in the history of democracy and the history of Egypt, and I do not know how Mr. Kerry, the then Secretary of State, saw that dark moment as the military, quote-unquote, restoring democracy. It is surprising that Mr. Kerry welcomed the military democracy. On the other hand, the violent groups in the Arab and Muslim world, or the counter-violent groups in the Arab and Muslim world, are not comfortable with the democratic process, so they would welcome a counter-violence as an alternative to the European and American support of dictatorship and authoritarianism. Muslim Democrats preferred and still insist on peaceful civilian democracy that respects the will of the indigenous people and build the bridges of understanding and mutual respect and mutual interest with the rest of the world. Here is the American-supported or favored military-style democracy looks like. I will share just quickly few examples of how the situation in Egypt after the military coup that was considered by the Secretary of State at that time to be restoring democracy. Thank you. So The rule of law index, Egypt, it was in 2016 number 110 out of 142. The rule of law index in 23, Egypt is 136 out of 132. And when democracy is denied, justice disappears, and then economic development does not go forward, political freedom is not available, to the extent that the military coup leader, General Sisi, arrested all those who wanted to compete with him in free and fair election, even military generals who wanted to compete in the election. When there is no democracy, democracy for post-colonial countries is not just a luxury. It's not really a luxury at all. It is a national security issue. It is a developmental issue. It is economic prosperity, because it presents transparency, accountability, which do not exist when there is military dictatorship. Due to time constraints, I will just leave all I was going to share. I will be happy to share with you what is happening in Egypt, how many people died in prison, how many people are suffering today, how there is no freedom of expression, there is no freedom of election, and I will share with you my conclusion. Supporting democracy in the Arab world is the humane and legitimate alternative for all stakeholders. Fake military democracy has led to a failed state. It is time to promote indigenous democracy and support the will of people, regardless whether we agree with their culture or not. I conclude that if we were not silent, and by silent I mean complicit, and I mean it specifically, knowingly or unknowingly, in denying the free people of Egypt their democracy by supporting and enabling continuation of oppression, starting by the military coup and everything after, we would have been able to avoid many atrocities in the Arab world, including the Tunisian coup and the genocide in Palestine. Like I said before, it is all connected. Thank you. Free, free Palestine.
Abdul Mawgood. Our next speaker is Danish Fadouqi. Can I call you doctor yet? Or yeah, you got the doctor title already. Okay, someone was doing their PhD, that's why I got confused. I read all the bios. Danish, who I've also seen at prior conferences here, is a visiting researcher here at Georgetown University at the School of Foreign Service, and he is going to speak to us about lessons from an Arab Spring activist and its shortcomings. Reflecting on the life of Professor Sa'adeddin Ibrahim, who I noted, who I think Radwan was once upon a time a professor of mine back at American University in Cairo. So I'm very eager to hear this remarks.
Is there space for me to get my...
Yeah, I think so, yeah.
Okay, yeah, I'm not doing anything interactive, just having the text up. So, good morning, everybody. Thank you so much for joining us. And thanks, Sarah, for setting the stage with the reminder that the individual I'm about to speak about has valence for a lot of us on a personal and a professional level. So on September 29th, 2023, the world lost one of its most celebrated human rights activists, Dr. Sa'adeddin Ibrahim of Egypt. But barring one standalone article by the Associated Press, the English-language global media did little to acknowledge this loss, merely curtsying to his passing as a footnote. This is unfortunate, as entire generations, both of academic scholars and social justice activists, were inspired by his work. Indeed, like Sarah mentioned, several people in this room have tangible debts to Dr. Saad, as he was affectionately called. I myself began my own scholarly journey as a researcher at his Cairo-based human rights think tank, the Ibn Khaldun Center for Development Studies. So much of this talk will be loosely informed by my own personal experiences. Born in 1938 in Mansoura, Ibrahim began his intellectual odyssey as a sociology undergraduate student at Cairo University. Here he also began his foray into political activism and organizing, serving as president of the student union. In 1962, he moved to the United States for advanced studies, earning a master's in sociological development from UCLA, and finally a PhD in political sociology from the University of Washington. He began his academic career teaching at DePauw University in Chicago from 1967 to 74, but built his major intellectual bona fides back in Egypt, serving as a professor in the Department of Sociology at the American University in Cairo for the rest of his academic career. As an academic scholar, Ibrahim conducted groundbreaking sociological studies based primarily in Egypt. Rereading his earlier essays in English and in Arabic reveal that Ibrahim was deeply vested in social science methodology. In his work on Islamic activism in Egypt, primarily through the Muslim Brotherhood, he demonstrates full command of sociological theory, engaging his subjects on the basis of class and social stratification, as well as ideology. A skilled ethnographer, he and his research team spent combined years interviewing Egyptian Islamists, including militant group members, while in prison. Additionally, he proved well-versed in quantitative methods, being able to weave through census data, election membership statistics, migration patterns, and economic data from organizations like the IMF. His studies on Islamic activism thus brought the rigor of an academic sociologist alongside the perspective of a cultural and linguistic insider. But Ibrahim's true talent as a researcher transcended his mastery of social science methodology. While he was clearly indebted to his training in Anglo-American sociology, he remained equally versed in Arab and Islamic thought and history. In particular, in multiple studies, he brought up the legacy of the 14th century Tunisian intellectual polymath Ibn Khaldun. Deemed the father of the discipline of sociology, Ibn Khaldun produced path-breaking works in multiple disciplines. His magnum opus, Al-Muqaddimah, offered a social, economic, and global history of the rise and fall of empires. In his evaluation of social movements, change, and revolutionary upheaval, Ibrahim repeatedly refers to Ibn Khaldun's theory of al-asabiyya, often translated as social cohesion. Ibrahim describes the phenomenon as a primordial form of solidarity, often associated with tribal loyalties. A strong commitment to asabiyya, he maintained, proved the impetus for seizing political power and instigating revolutionary social change. Though he was clear that tribal solidarity was not in itself sufficient to fully solidify social revolution, in his interpretation of the Khaldunian paradigm, asabiyya must be coupled by a religious mission, which offers a spiritual raison d'etre for a new political movement's long-term success. He points to the Saudi Wahhabi movement in Saudi Arabia, the Sanusi movement in Libya, and the Mahdist movement in the Sudan as the last embodiments of the Khaldunian paradigm at work. Now, it's interesting that the Egyptian sociologist gravitated so deeply towards this particular medieval thinker. After all, many figures in the Arab and Islamic intellectual history offered him worthy intellectual interlocutors on governance and social change. But Ibn Khaldun was unique because of how interdisciplinary he was in his approach to social change. His cyclical history owed as much to the study of economics and demography as it did to the study of historiography. More specifically, Ibn Khaldun stands alone as perhaps the most systematic theorist of social society in Islamic intellectual history. That commitment to the interplay of democratic institutions to push back against the authoritarian political structures throughout the Arab world came to define Sa'duddin Ibrahim's work both as an academic scholar and as a political activist. He thus founded a human rights NGO specifically to promote the development of civil society and democratization, aptly titled the Ibn Khaldun Center for Development Studies, which housed his most innovative research projects on promoting civic culture and institutions in Egypt and the greater Arab world. Those cravings for civil society led him to emphasize the rights of minorities, pioneering studies in the systematic discrimination against Coptic Christians in Egypt. Similarly, his decades of academic work on Islamists led him to make the controversial case that the Muslim Brotherhood must be granted a legitimate space in Egyptian politics and civil society. The group's exclusion from the public sphere, he warned, would necessarily lead to its membership seeking illicit and potentially violent avenues for articulating its vision. And in addition to relying on the legacy of Ibn Khaldun, Ibrahim grounded his vision on the work of innovative Arab thinkers from the 19th and early 20th century. Like him, this cadre of thinkers sought a vibrant public sphere and had managed to make considerable strides throughout the region prior to the Arab defeat by Israel in 1948. Following the intellectual historian Albert Hourani, Ibrahim refers to this period as the Liberal Age and explicitly identifies it as part of his inspiration. He was thus an avowed descendant of the tradition of Arab liberalism, following in the footsteps of intellectual giants like the Egyptian literateur and former Minister of Education Taha Hussein. Not accidentally, many of these figures associated with the Liberal Age had a soft spot for the work of Ibn Khaldun. And like his colleagues in the Liberal Age, Ibrahim found himself in the crosshairs of the authorities for his research and advocacy on civil society, particularly for his training volunteers in election monitoring, such that in 2000, the Egyptian regime under Hosni Mubarak accused him of using foreign funds to finance his election monitoring campaign and duly sentenced him to prison. Languishing in prison for 3 years, Ibrahim's health deteriorated rapidly. Through international pressure, he was eventually released in 2003, seeking exile for years in the United States. Now, fast forward to the events of 2011 Arab Spring, it seemed that the aging sociologist had gotten the last laugh. Indeed, Middle East historian Juan Cole offered precisely this prescription, penning an article days before Mubarak's resignation in February 2011, reminding his reader that the protesters in Tahrir Square were inspired precisely by Saad ad-Din Ibrahim's vision for a democratic Egypt. His article was aptly titled Saad's Revolution. Or so we thought. In the events of 2013, several major liberal activists and intellectuals in Egypt radically shifted their perspectives, now cheering on the return of military rule. And regrettably, Dr. Saad ad-Din Ibrahim wound up buying into the euphoria of Abdel Fattah al-Sisi. Most infamously, in an interview for the newspaper Al-Yom al-Sabi', he was quoted as saying that the 2014 presidential elections were, quote, the greatest in the history of Egypt. Now, what led to this change of heart? As I and my colleague Dalia Fahmy explored in great detail in our last book, the project of Arab liberalism to which Ibrahim subscribed was beholden ultimately to a series of authoritarian contradictions, such that liberals were willing to actively forge authoritarian alliances to forcibly impose their liberal and in many cases militantly secular worldview on an otherwise unwilling populace. Most recently, with Morsi and the Muslim Brotherhood actually in control of the state rather than at its fringes, the intellectual consistency of Ibrahim's project could not fully sustain itself. With his passing, though, it behooves us to recognize the contradictions of his thinking, particularly the same blind spots beyond Egypt. All over the Muslim majority context, we see liberal and leftist thinkers who are so terrified of a public role for Islam that they're willing to ally with the most horrific forms of authoritarianism to extirpate it. Thus, working through Saad ad-Din Ibrahim's legacy will be pivotal in confronting this ongoing challenge throughout the region. But more importantly, we must end by celebrating the immense good Saad ad-Din Ibrahim's legacy leaves us. I'll end by offering the reminder from the medieval Muslim polymath Abu Hamid al-Ghazali, who in his Book of Knowledge points out that the right of the teacher over his student is greater than the right of the father. For a teacher is one who brings to the student eternal life, while the father is the cause only of his temporal life. As a teacher to so many of us, I'll end by offering the good doctor an immense thanks for his tutelage, wisdom, and kindness. Inna lillahi wa inna ilayhi raji'un. Thank you very much.
Well, good afternoon, morning, late morning, everybody. I'd like to take this opportunity to thank CSID and the conference host, the Center for Christian-Muslim Understanding here at Georgetown University. Is that better? Okay. This paper is essentially part of a book project I'm working on ethno-religious nationalism in Malaysia. The project started when I was based at Georgetown a few years ago. Initially, it was just focused on Malaysia's political trajectory, looking closely at the breakthrough election in 2018, when a government that had been in power for 61 years was overturned via the ballot box. And a new opposition coalition was elected to office, to federal government. However, I was here during the Trump administration, and what I noticed was the marked similarity between Malaysian politics and US politics during the Trump administration. In particular, the ethno-religious nationalism emanating from the Trump administration. Similarities between that and the governments, the past government in Malaysia and current government in Malaysia. So, many of the presentations focus on Arab states. Well, mine focuses on a Muslim majority state in Southeast Asia. And I believe there's one or two other presentations that does that. Well, I guess it makes sense because there are more Muslims in the non-Arab world than there are in non-Arab world than there are in the Arab world. Okay, so in my presentation as well, I have referred to Islamists in a shorthand manner. What I'm referring to are hardline Islamists. Okay. So there is a deepening global democratic recession that has persisted for about 2 decades. And the manifestation of this democratic recession includes the resurgence of authoritarian ethno-religious nationalism. And it's sweeping across the world, not just in the Muslim world. And because I've only got 10 minutes rather than the original 15, I will skip through many of the slides. Now, the ascendancy of ethno-religious nationalism is somewhat paradoxical. In view of the decline in religiosity, according to many studies, particularly in this century, or late 20th, early 21st century, yet there has been this ascendancy of religious, ethno-religious nationalism. So that's a bit of a paradox. And some academics and scholars have written about this paradox, and there have been interesting studies done on that, one in particular by Ronald Inglehart and a few polling agencies. And I think the latest book by Fareed Zakaria that had just come out also looks at this paradox. Now, ethno-religious nationalists have become dominant actors across various political systems, and hence the comparative approach is an insightful one to study this phenomenon. So in my study, I look at transitional and fledgling democracies in Southeast Asia, that is Malaysia and Indonesia. And I might add here, Indonesia is considered arguably the most democratic Muslim majority country in the world, located in Southeast Asia. We have military-dominated Buddhist ethnocracies such as Myanmar or Burma, abandoned secular democratic states governed by partly free authoritarian religious nationalist governments in India and Turkey, settler colonial ethnocracies such as Israel, a backsliding settler colonial democracy, and I've included the United States in that category of being a settler colonial democracy, and Australia as well in my case study. Established liberal democracies such as the European Union and electoral post-communist autocracies such as Putin's Russia and Hungary under Orban. Now, ethno-nationalism, religious nationalism, departs from civic nationalism in that ethno-religious nationalism rejects civic nationalism rejects vertical forms of ethnic hierarchy in favor of horizontal forms of citizenship rights, sometimes referred to as democratic citizenship, and that is consistent with the multicultural or multiracial democracy ideal. Now, we find, particularly in places such as in Europe, conservative political parties have gravitated further to the right, doing deals with far-right political parties and movements. And Brexit is an example of that. The EU, in the EU, we find many far-right anti-immigration parties that have made gains, electoral gains, and many of these, particularly far-right parties, are very much inspired by the great replacement conspiracy theory, which I'm sure most of us have heard about, fixation on stopping limiting the migration of non-Europeans to their countries. And Hungary's Orban is a clear example of this. Now in India, if we move to Asia, we find the rise of Hindutva majoritarian supremacy from a state that was envisioned by the founders and framers as a secular democracy. In Myanmar, we find Buddhist hegemony supported paradoxically by Democrats and reformers. And Aung San Suu Kyi has been heavily criticized for not caring too much about the marginalization of the Rohingya community. So, I mean, this highlights that even Democrats and Nobel Peace Prize winners have ignored the human rights of minority communities. I've also written in my paper how the way by which race trumps class in many of these ethno-religious nationalist movements. And I've got 2 minutes to work on my central case study, and that is Malaysia. A country that is going through an unstable political transition since 2018, when this governing, the party that had been in government for 6 decades was overturned via the ballot box. However, the government that was elected to office was overturned via an insider coup, a bloodless insider coup by ethno-religious nationalists unhappy with the reform, the political, social, and economic reform agenda of these ethno-religious nationalists, in particular the Ketuanan Melayu doctrine that was promoted by this government. Now, so the Pakistan government collapsed in 2020. It was then re-elected in 2022. So it's now in power, led by Prime Minister Anwar Ibrahim, who I believe is a fellow at Georgetown University still. But what I've been concerned about is the way by which this government, this second Pakistan government, has reneged on many of its promised political, social, economic reforms, has capitulated to the demands of ethno-nationalists and even adopted many policies that are quite authoritarian in the appeasement of ethno-nationalists. And I've given many examples of this backsliding of this ostensibly reformist government. And we find that the politicization of Islam by this government is quite similar to that of previous ethno-nationalists. Now, I'll just end off by noting the importance of coalition building, because what we have, these two reformist governments, basically are in coalition with ethno-nationalist parties. And that has in many ways derailed and destabilized the political, economic, and social reform agenda. So in other words, careful, these reformist governments need to be very careful with regard to their coalition partners. And so we have a government that is vulnerable, that is backtracked on its reform agenda. In terms of course correction, the jury is still out whether they will relook and make changes, because basically, despite the capitulation, this ostensibly reformist government has not pleased ethno-nationalists, neither has it pleased its coalition support, its reformist supporters that put it in, elected it to office. And there's even speculation of another coup, insider coup in the making. So it's a very, how would you say, tumultuous political environment in Malaysia at the moment. And I'll end off there. Sorry for the few minutes that I've extended into. Thank you.
Wish we had more time. That was a very good presentation. Thank you.
Thank you very much, and good morning. Thank you for the introduction. And a particular note of gratitude to Dr. Masmoudi and CSID for the opportunity to be with you here today and participate in this wonderful conference, a very important conference. So why Uzbekistan? It's not a country that has ever had a free and fair election, as judged by the OSCE or other election observers who value free and fair elections. It's not a country that is particularly known for democratic transformation. It's a country that has been authoritarian since its independence. So what makes this a topic of discussion at a conference such as this, particularly a country relatively far afield from the region that we're talking about today? Well, I would state, first of all, that this is a country that is 96% Muslim according to state statistics. It's a population of 35.6 million in the heart of Central Asia. There are 2,040 official mosques in Uzbekistan and 9,361 mahallas, each serving between 500 to 10,000 residents. And critically, it has a population under age 24, constituting 40% of the country's population and growing. If you take that up to age 30, it's an even higher percentage, nearly 50%. So a very young and upcoming country with demands of a growing youth population. I would start in the argument discussion of Uzbekistan's seeming transformation or ambitions to become democratic by noting several of points in its recent history. But I would also say that this is not a country that has undergone a color revolution. There was no Tashkent Spring to speak of. But there is a desire among the leadership and the population of Uzbekistan to break from its post-Soviet authoritarian condition and its past and develop into a modern people's state that is economically viable, that is certainly located in a critical part of the world, a crossroads on the Silk Road, and one that values human rights above all and aspires to create a new Uzbekistan or a people's state. And in that vein, since the passing of Islam Karimov in 2016, the new president, Shavkat Mirziyoyev, has instituted numerous national development strategies that have attempted to address the shortcomings of the Uzbek state since inception, particularly looking at its economic viability, development of trade routes, development of a tolerant attitude towards religion, and an independent identity that breaks from its past as a Soviet socialist republic. There have been numerous achievements made through the various state strategies. The one initially instituted in 2017 after Mr. Mirziyoyev's first election, and his second five-year strategy, which was billed as the building of the people's state under a new Uzbekistan. While mainly these achievements appeared to be economically oriented in developing a series of reforms in the judicial sector, addressing the embedded and rampant state of corruption in Uzbekistan, they also touched upon building human person-to-person development, creating a socially responsible state that puts the people out in front and not the government or local officials, trying to build in decision-making at all levels and a responsible mindset among a civically inclined people. Well, the institution of these reforms, of course, as you would imagine, differs from the reality on the ground. Nonetheless, to continue advancing the reforms, under the president's leadership in 2023, there was a major rewriting of the Constitution, which included the recommendations of 220,000 individual recommendations by citizens of the country on what they would like to see change, what they would like to see done differently as part of the national constitution. The idea of a constitutional referendum is not necessarily a positive one in the post-Soviet lexicon. Nonetheless, they proceeded with a referendum that, of course, passed. And while many of the really positive ideas about building citizenship and invigorating the civic and political culture in Uzbekistan were in that set of changes, they were perhaps overlooked because of what came to be viewed in the West as the key negatives in this process, and those being the extension of the president's term from 5 to 7 years and the ability to serve 2 new terms in office. Again, a stratagem often used by the authoritarian leaders of the post-Soviet states. Now, this, of course, was accompanied by a snap presidential election, which Mr. Mirziyoyev prevailed in. And that brings us to today. We have in Uzbekistan a set of reforms outlined by the various national strategies, and now the launch of the Uzbekistan 2030 strategy, which foresees within the next 6 years to build a modern state that is, again, economically viable, that integrates with its neighbors peacefully, that is a regional hegemon within Central Asia, and can stand up to the heavyweights in the region that, with whom it both cooperates and competes, that being, of course, China, the Russian Federation, and to a degree Turkey, who it does see as a model of development to some degree. I would add one of the big ambitions of this set of reforms is to reform the state of the mahallas, the local community committees that really guide and govern people's everyday lives in Uzbekistan. Not a unique phenomenon to the country, but one that is part of its identity, part of its brand, that can, in fact, be a source of grassroots development of democratic ideals, while also being a source of day-to-day law and guidelines and principles by which people live their lives. Now, there are several, and I'll get to these quickly, internal pressure points that need to be taken into account during this project, which is now, as Mr. Mirziyoyev is in his 8th year of power, are becoming more intense. And one is the strict control of religious expression. Uzbekistan has never been a country that has been seen, even with the recent reforms, as particularly tolerant of religious expression. There is a state religion, state-approved mosques. There a certain view of Islam that must be followed. There is an intolerance for what it sees as diversions from that path. For example, any act that may be seen as part of civil disobedience, but are related back to challenges of a radicalized nature, as seen in Andijan in 2004. And of recent vintage, the Crocus City Hall massacres in Moscow, which had a repercussion in Uzbekistan, whereby the passports of imams were seized lest they travel abroad or lest they be involved somehow in radicalizing populations. There were no Uzbeks who were implicated in the attack, but pressure was put on by the government to assure that there would be no future activities by ethnic Uzbeks following suit. As we know, there were some 4,000 Uzbeks who had participated in ISIS in Syria. There are also fallout from the constitutional reform process in the early elections, including the lack of an ability for citizens to monitor those elections as domestic observers. We have a very difficult situation with respect to civil society. There are few truly independent civil society organizations, and what we have is the prevalence of government-organized NGOs, who are in many ways also funded and well-resourced. As mentioned, a growing youth population with rising expectations for their ability to earn a living and build their country and not have to leave as labor migrants to countries such as Russia, Turkey, Middle East, or Southeast Asia. But yet a growing economic inequality and still the persistence of labor migration outside of the country. External pressure points, first and foremost, relations with the Russian Federation, which still wields a very large influence over the country, as Uzbekistan tries to appease both the Russians as well as the West in dealing with economic sanctions put upon Russia. Uzbekistan had been envisioned by Moscow as a potential transit point. They have tried to address this, yet keep good relations. Uzbekistan is not a member of Russian-led organizations such as the CSTO or the Eurasian Economic Union, nonetheless must maintain good relations, given the thousands of Uzbek citizens working in that country as labor migrants. We have increased engagement with the West as Uzbekistan wants to reinvent itself as a democratic engine, economic engine within Central Asia, yet declining democratic credentials, even with the advent of these national strategies and these efforts to build committees and institutions within Uzbekistan that put people ahead of the government. And the country's vision of itself as a regional organizer of peace and security within the region, which also includes a shared border with Afghanistan, which has caused the Tashkent leadership some degree of discomfort in addition. So, what is the future for democracy in Uzbekistan with all of these many factors in consideration? I have a few recommendations, both for the authorities in Uzbekistan in building democracy, as well as for those who are on the outside supporting democratic development in Uzbekistan. I'll go very quickly through these. You can see them. First is providing a mandate for sequential civic education for young people at all levels of school in the country. Building civic culture, building a culture of democracy from the ground up is imperative. It is lacking in the country. It is imperative for any successful democracy to take root in Uzbekistan. Opening the political space and allowing political parties to register. We have the same five political parties in the Oli Majlis that we had during the last election New parties have not only been not allowed to be registered, they have been blacklisted in many ways, with their members beaten, tortured, intimidated. That would include also expediting direct and local elections to hakims, loosening restrictions on the activities of civil society who are heavily regulated by the Ministry of Justice and do wonderful work, but are impeded in doing so by the heavy hand of the ministry. And also clarifying the role of mahalas, which can serve, in fact, in a very positive manner in both in the election process, but also in promoting and strengthening the equal rights of citizens, particularly women, and promoting civic resilience. One recent and important reform was the appointment to the mahalas of a person dealing with gender equality issues. Let's see how this plays out. Hopefully this will reinvigorate and allow more opportunities for women. And for those in the West, the US and Europe who are supporting democracy, hold this government accountable to the points it has committed itself to in the National Development Strategy, in front of the United Nations and the international community, particularly concerning human rights. Press for democratic development and equal opportunities to expand trade relations and bilateral relations and person-to-person contact. Invest in Uzbekistan's youth and make civic and legal education a priority. View the human dimension in Uzbekistan through an intersectional lens and provide assistance to those doubly marginalized groups, including women with disabilities and young people and minority communities. Very critically, provide training for investigative journalism, particularly young women journalists, as the media sector continues, unfortunately, under this government to contract in spite of recent promises. And of course, support the work of independent non-governmental organizations in spite of the enormous pressures they face. They're doing good work. They need our support, because democracy is not a top-down process. It's a grassroots, bottom-up process in concert with a government that is not only willing, that is not only stated its desire to institute reform, but is showing the political will to do so. Thank you very much.
Thank you. The fifth panelist today joining us is David Mednikoff. Happy to see him here again at this conference and to have the opportunity to listen to his remarks. David is the chair of the Department of Judaic and Near Eastern Studies at UMass Amherst, and is speaking to us today about the rule of law and democracy's denial in contemporary Arab politics. Lessons learned, but more importantly, I'm eager to hear about strategies for change. David?
Thanks so much, and I also want to thank Dr. Mahmoudi and everybody, because I think that the opportunity to really be in a space not only where we're talking about democracy in the Middle East, but doing it in a democratic and open way it's very hard to find now. So it's wonderful to be here. So I want to talk about the rule of law. The rule of law is probably the last global political ideal that governments and people tend to champion, at least rhetorically. But I'm going to argue that we need to understand the rule of law as contested and diverse, and also consonant with the realities of legal politics in the MENA and elsewhere, and the challenges to democracy globally. And so let me start with the United Nations definition, and I'm going to be whipping through a lot of material very quickly. My response to time diminishments is to be a fast talker, so please forgive me. And so, the UN definition, which USAID and many others adopt, and it's reasonable to do so, says that the rule of law is a principle where all people, including national governments, are accountable to laws that are independently adjudicated and consistent with international human rights and standards. In other words, the rule of law is best understood, or most commonly understood, is about constraining government and also being kind of more broadly consistent with liberal democratic norms. And so this is, I think, a very common way, shorthand, that a lot of folks might think about the rule of law, that there's this kind of virtuous circle between the rule of law and democratization. I'd like to call it the Reese's peanut butter cup paradigm. You know, like chocolate and peanut butter are great tastes that taste great together. So democracy and the rule of law are these wonderful things that go completely well together. And my work on the politics of the rule of law in the Middle East and more globally pushes back a little bit against this, because what I want to show briefly, and then get into some data from work I've actually done in the region, is that rule of law can mean a lot of different things, and they're not, those things don't necessarily always reinforce democracy, so we have to think about how they actually work. And you know, another popular culture way of appreciating this is a TV show like Law and Order actually talks about how essentially one vision of the rule of law from this TV show that's, you know, continues in its forms combines policing. I mean, law actually refers to the police in this TV show, and, you know, order refers to the legal pieces. And so, you know, right there you have encapsulated this idea that the rule of law contains dimensions that are both about law enforcement and about rights. And those two things are not necessarily always consistent, certainly when we're talking about democratization. Now, you know, organizations that try to measure the rule of law obviously do understand that this is complex. The World Justice Project, which I think is now the leader of rule of law measurements, has a variety of criteria that are all embedded under this term, the rule of law. And again, if you look at them, what you see is some of these things are about order or preventing corruption, which can be done, and indeed can be done very well, under highly repressive political systems, and others are about freedoms and, you know, things that we might associate with democratization. And of course, organizations like this do this deliberately so that we understand the rule of law as something that's complex. But then on the other hand, you know, many of us seek simple numbers, you know, an index. And so if you take all this stuff together and you look at a number about how countries do, for example, the UAE looks quite good. It's 37th globally, and, you know, it's a yay, rule of law in the UAE. But then when you look at where it excels and where it doesn't, I mean, these are dimensions that are not necessarily leading to democratization. Similarly, when we look at the World Bank indicators, governance indicators, the Middle East and North Africa, you know, isn't terrible on the rule of law. And I appreciate that obviously in Egypt, under its present government, it's towards the bottom. But, you know, Gulf Arab countries fare quite well. This, as you probably know, these are percentiles. So most countries in the Middle East and North Africa are better on the rule of law by this governance indicator than the majority of countries in the world. But when you look at other governance indicators that are more about indicators of democracy, you know, this is where Middle East countries don't do so well. That was the Voice and Accountability World Bank indicator, and this is the Freedom of Expression Index from Article 19 organization, which shows most Middle Eastern and North Africa countries not just bad on freedom of expression, but in, you know, deep crisis. That's what the dark red shows. So when you look at governance indicators altogether, you know, this idea that rule of law actually tells us that states are moving towards liberal democracy or consistent with liberal democratic norms is somewhat undermined. And this is why rule of law politics is this kind of global thing where lots of countries will put on shows around the rule of law and show that they really, or argue that they're really committed to the rule of law. But it's exactly because these norms are so contestable that they can do that while scoring low on exactly some of the features that are most prominent in a definition like the UN's. So what I want to say theoretically in a very simple way is that instead of thinking about the rule of law in this Reese's peanut butter cup paradigm, as much as I love Reese's peanut butter cups personally, one simple way to think of it is more of a sort of a seesaw, where, norms can either be or both authoritarian leaning or democratic leaning, and they're contested. It's a constant sort of contest, and that's how I want us to sort of think about it. So what I want to do now is summarize very briefly some data that I was very privileged to collect a while ago, and it's hard to do this kind of work, so, if anybody out there is interested in replicating this work or has some funding, please talk to me. I'm looking to redo this. So what I was able to do through a grant from the Qatar National Research Fund was really look at how law students and aligned students in Qatar and Kuwait and lawyers, in the region talked about the rule of law. We did surveys, detailed surveys in Arabic on, what does the rule of law mean to you? And what the data really show is exactly what I'm sort of saying. People care about the rule of law. There's a lot of contestation about the rule of law, but it doesn't fit into some simple government ought to be limited by law category, nor does it connect necessarily to the idea that international legal norms are the way to think about the rule of law. And again, this is not to say that this contestation can't be connected to democratization in some way. So with the limited time that I have, I'm not really even, I'd love to go over some of this data. It's really rich, and I don't think people have seen surveys of lawyers and law students. But what I'm just going to cut to what it says. And I also have a lot of remarks from Qatari and non-Qatari lawyers that really emphasize that international lawyers tend to come with this kind of neo-imperial mindset of, lawyers in the country don't know what they're doing. And the lawyers in the country have a very rich discourse around what they think that they're doing. Oh, I'm sorry, this is not what I meant to show. So, again, the summary of all this data is that there is a lot of contestation around rule of law norms, but they're framed often in different terms than simple Western-centered definitions might suggest. And because rule of law norms are contested so much, but they're not often unpacked in this contestational way, it's easy for governments to take advantage of that to really obscure the disconnection between what they are doing in terms of parts of the rule of law and the possibilities of democratization. So in terms of what's ways forward, I would not argue, and I'm happy to talk more in the QA, that one should give up on the idea of the global rule of law. I don't think that serves the challenges that the region is facing that are, obviously dramatic and heartbreaking. But I do think that rule of law framing and promotion can take advantage of the way that local values are contested. And I think that, organizations are leading to do this. USAID has a new strategy that's called people-centered justice. And we just heard from IFIS, that this kind of bottom-up approach is really becoming more and more important. The other thing that I would bring to the mix that we haven't talked about at all today is that I do think that regional institutions, regional approaches to big problems, including the rule of law, are really worth considering. After all, one of the ways that international law, human rights developed well in Europe was through regionalization. And so what I would very much, what I work on in a lot of other ways in the region is thinking about as bad as regional institutions have a record, how, what might emerge from the current reshuffling in the Middle East and North Africa is a focus on regional institutions that could also start thinking more broadly about adapting norms around the rule of law to more local realities. Thank you very much.
those remarks, and I look forward to our discussion. But before we turn to our discussion, I wanted to take a moment to recognize that today is 1 year since the dictatorship in Tunisia has jailed great political leader and great activist Rashid Ghannouchi. And I hope you can all join me in wishing him hope and inspiration, and sending our message of hope and inspiration that he will be released from his unjust imprisonment. I think, as most of you know, the Tunisian dictatorship relentlessly harassed Mr. Ghannouchi ever since Qais Said was able to usurp power in the country, subjecting him to numerous interrogations and incursions into his home, and finally using its now controlled judiciary to bring bogus charges against him, for which he is now facing 3 years of imprisonment. It is a very sad day, but I am heartened by the optimism and hope that Mr. Ghannouchi is giving to all of us in allowing us to consider his continued imprisonment and the imprisonment of other political detainees in Tunisia today as a hopeful sign of resistance, as a hopeful refusal to bow to tyranny. We are all indebted and grateful to the sacrifices that Mr. Ghannouchi is making by refusing to bow his head to this tyranny and giving us strength to resist and fight against the continued oppression in the country. So I just wanted to take a moment to reflect on that today. Before turning to question and answer, and inviting those of you to please come to the stage. We have until 12:17, so please introduce yourself and please make a question if you can, and not comments. Starting there.
So I have two questions. My name is Salih Yasun. I am an assistant professor at Virginia Military Institute, focusing on political science. My first question is for Mr. Darderi. First of all, I'm really sorry about the suffering of Egyptian parliamentarians. My question is, what do you see the future of your party in Egypt moving forward? Do you see any future for your party in the near term or in the long term? And do you see any scenarios for transition away from the current military regime in Egypt? Again, in the near term or more in the long term perspective. Should I ask my second question or wait?
Let's give him a chance to respond, maybe, okay, especially if it's for another speaker.
Yes.
Yeah.
Thank you. Thank you for your support and for your concern about the suffering of not only the 100 members of parliament, but the 60,000 political prisoners, not only the 60,000, but the rest of the country, because it is suffering from lack of freedom of speech, lack of freedom of movement. People are not free, are being suffocated. And it's very unfortunate that we here in America, as an Egyptian American, we send our tax dollar money to support such a authoritarian, criminal, dictatorial regime. That's very important to be said. Now, concerning the future, the Freedom and Justice Party was the majority party when the military coup took place. Because there is no freedom in Egypt now, so it is very difficult to project what is going to happen in the near future. But in the long term, the members of the Freedom and Justice Party are determined to continue their democratic march. They are insisting on democratization of Egypt, and will continue with what will work. They will continue the work with other political parties, and now they're developing alliances here and there. There are many attempts in promoting a better alternative, not only for the Freedom and Justice Party members, but for all Egyptians. And I look forward for a better future for all Egyptians, where we have the rule of law as the way to go, and where we have the military goes back to its barracks, and the civilians will be able to run the country, and then there will be peaceful transition of power.
I will ask my second question later.
Okay. All right. Take one from this side.
All right. I guess it's good afternoon now. My name is Sam Green. I'm a faculty member at Shepherd University in political science and global studies. My question touches on the rule of law as well as Uzbekistan and Egypt. Whoever would like to answer can. It strikes me that a common theme between these three presentations is the absence of equality before the law in terms of political participation and sometimes also for everyday citizens. And I wonder to what extent reforms are basically performative and what external actors can do to encourage reforms to be less performative and more real in that area. Thank you.
Sure.
Can I get to my slides? I'm sorry. Yeah, so I'll be brief, and there's lots of questions. But I think what I want to emphasize is that it makes sense to talk about things around rule of law and equality in terms that people actually frame them in society. So I mean, this is just one little snapshot, but the data that I collected from lawyers and law students in Kuwait and Qatar very clearly articulates that justice, and we know this of course from the Arab Spring, is a value and a norm that's articulated as very important. And there are all these different ways of framing rule of law that resonate in societies, and I mean, there's no simple answer with the challenges of authoritarianism in the world and in the region. But at the very least, having conversations around how legal values are framed within societies that then might empower transformation, is one way to approach things. Thanks.
In regard to the situation in Egypt, external factors can do a lot because the situation in Egypt, the country is closed, and it's very difficult for Egyptians inside Egypt to participate in any work of promoting democracy or equality in front of the law. In fact, the military regime is making sure that there is no equality. Even the General Sisi said that he wants only few people to be highly educated, and then they lead the rest of the country. It is that mindset that runs the country. But in spite of this, there are so many Egyptians in exile now and living throughout the whole world, indeed. And I hope that external actors will be able to help create a space for those who are in exile to speak about what is going on inside Egypt, and also help promote certain ways of creating coalitions and helping certain ways of promoting alternative to the existing situation. I was just talking about Uzbekistan, and I wanted to know really how Nahda, for example, Renaissance movement, or other movements are doing in combating military dictatorship, especially when this military dictatorship is supported by regional powers as well as by countries that I used to think of them as democratic and promoting democracy. And to be honest with you, I always thought, I graduated from University of Pittsburgh, and I always thought of America as a great country supporting democracy, human rights, and rule of law, until I discovered the reality that the United States of America is not supporting democracy, human rights, and rule of law in Egypt. And that's a fact that we need to share together so that we find ways and means from here and in relationship to the Egyptians living in different parts of the world.
Just a very quick word on Uzbekistan. So there are internal conflicts in the country, clearly. First, we lack a real culture of law in spite of the reforms that have been attempted. Certainly this was very much the case under Islam Karimov. It has persisted under Mirziyoyev. However, that situation is changing. There is a good amount of top-down judicial reform, replacement of judges, and greater will. Those who are not beholden to the former leader have been replaced. But we still have a tradition of maintaining power and control, which harkens back to the post-Soviet legacies of independence of the Central Asian republics, Uzbekistan foremost among them. But we also have an issue, a tougher one in some ways, that it pervades inequality, and that is, frankly, traditions in the country whereby women are kept, in spite of what the Constitution may say, and may say even stronger today, the real circumstances for women and women's rights in the country is very much wanting. And this is being pervaded by men who see them as second-class citizens and will block efforts for women to become leaders in their communities, to speak out, even have mobile phones, and is in many ways prohibited, not legally, but factually. And so we're fighting some cultural norms, and it gets back to, I think someone mentioned earlier, this kind of this duality or this fight between traditions and modernity. We want everybody to have equal rights, but there are certain practices that predate even the Soviet period that are difficult to root out and have become further now ingrained in this era of so-called independence and freedom. Not easy to resolve, but as I mentioned before, a culture of law, a mindset of equality, building human rights from the beginning in school, civic, legal education is a vital step in taking that direction.
Thanks. Radwan, how much time is there?
10 more minutes.
Okay. I have to depart, but maybe you can take over the moderation. Unfortunately, I have a very fixed commitment, but maybe we'll take the...
I think the gentleman there was before me.
okay, the next question, and I thank you all, and you'll continue moderating. Okay.
Hi, my name is Jackson Tisdale. I'm a foreign policy intern.
Speak more directly to the mic, please.
Oh, yeah. Sorry. My name is Jackson Tisdale. I'm a foreign policy intern with the National Interest Foundation. And my question is, so given that there is this religious nationalism that is leading towards democratic backsliding, on the other hand, there's also religious civil society organizations that kind of promote democracy. For example, in Nicaragua, where the Catholic Church has kind of opposed the Ortega regime. So my question is, how can these religious groups kind of combat this rhetoric coming from populists who tried to use religious rhetoric to co-opt the public?
And is your question addressed to a specific panelist?
Open for the panel, but particularly for Dr. Rahim.
For whom?
Dr. Rahim.
Okay, I might stand up because I'm really jet lagged, and this will keep me awake. Right, with regard to religious nationalism, I've been looking at the Tunisian political trajectory really carefully, and I found Rashid Ghannouchi's writings, in particular the latest publication with Professor Marsh, to be really insightful in terms of building a Muslim democracy, the nuts and bolts of building that. And you rightly pointed out, there are various religious nationalists that adopt different perspectives in terms of their theological understanding, their reading or rereading of the religious texts. And the problem with Malaysian, most Malaysian religious nationalists, Islamists, in particular the hardline Islamists, is that they're very much inspired by Wahhabi interpretations of the texts, the Islamic texts and the Quran. And the Saudis have done a great job promoting Wahhabi Salafi Islam, particularly from the 1980s. So that has become mainstream Islam in Malaysia, in, I would go so far as to say, Indonesia as well. Not so much Indonesia, but, and also many parts of the Islamic Muslim world. So we need more Rashid Ghannouchis that are building that interpretation of Islam based on social justice, based on equal citizenship rights, equal meaning, equal rights for men and women, which means a reinterpretation of Sharia law. Mainstream Sharia readings do not accept that men and women have equal rights, not complementarity, but equality. And also equal citizenship rights for Muslims as well as non-Muslims. That means in Muslim majority states, non-Muslims can hold leadership positions, cabinet positions. The current Chief Justice in Malaysia is a woman, Tengku Maimun. That is one of the positives that have come out of the reformist government. So that is why I didn't have time to develop this. The notion of equal citizenship rights is really, really important in the Muslim world. Thank you.
So go ahead.
Yeah, hello. My question, I guess, will be, my name is Bedirhan Mutlu. I'm a PhD student at the George Washington University from Mr. Abdul Mabgout Dareri. I was in Egypt. When I first went to Egypt in 2016, just a couple of hours after my flight arrived in Egypt, there was a military coup attempt in Turkey. And my friends in Egypt were puzzled by my stance there because I was almost crying because of what was happening. And then they thought I was a big supporter of Erdogan. And I said, no, I criticize Erdogan on so many instances. And they were like, what's happening here? And I'm looking back to the coup in 2013 in Egypt in the sense that, well, you condemned people who supported the coup, but let's be honest, a lot of the people and parties who were, even those who were in coalition with your party in the parliament, supported the coup in Egypt, and that's a problem. And as opposed to the 2016 one in Turkey, where a lot of the opposition parties who were critical of Erdogan, and a lot of people who were critical of Erdogan, like myself, categorically opposed the coup attempt. But the issue is people see this in sort of a good thing in Turkey. That's not what I'm, sorry.
Sir, in the interest of time, could you get to your question, please?
So my question is, in Turkey, it took 2 coup attempts and 2 military interventions, though, for the public to arrive there. You know, it was not natural. So what can we do in Egypt or in other countries to achieve this kind of thing without waiting 80 years, like in Turkey, to achieve this kind of popular sort of unity against military coups or other kinds of coups?
Okay, thank you, sir. I'm wondering if we could just go and collect a series of questions in the interest of time. Then we, as a panel, will handle them collectively. Go ahead, ma'am.
This question is for Lily, Dr. Rahim. So I'm Ani Zonova, Muslims for Progressive Values. I'm originally from Malaysia, so I'm very much in tune with the what's going on there in regards to the fascist sentiment and how Islam is being practiced there, having family there. So my question to you is that how can we actually create more civil society-minded and faith-based minded organizations that that repel this ethno-Islamist agenda that you're talking about, when anyone that deviates from the Islamic or state definition of Islam is accused of being an apostate and blasphemous and is thrown in jail.
Okay, now, go ahead, please.
I'm Ashraf Haidari, Afghan ambassador and associate with Georgetown University. My question is for Dr. Boyer. Now, with the fall of Afghanistan's young democracy and the way it was unfortunately betrayed in 2021, how that has affected demand among Uzbeks, rank and file, for the institutionalization of democracy, human rights, and so forth in Uzbekistan, given your extensive research there. Thank you.
And anybody else who's considering, please step up.
Yeah, my name is Ghulam Rabbani. I am an exile here. I came from Bangladesh, who is the largest Muslim, 4th largest Muslim populated country in the world. And my question directly to Mr. Anthony Bauer. I think he is working for International Foundation for Electoral Support or Electoral System. And I know we are, I'm the victim of electoral autocratic system. And, the whole, the enemy of democracy, they are all united. They have consortium. But who are seeking democracy, demanding democracy, they are actually innocent person. And they don't have enough power, they don't have enough consortium. So my question is to you, I know you have a lots of reform system, policy, and want to adopt in different countries, but how do you support that innocent people who have not that much power to control their electoral engineering, and which is conducting in the name of democracy, and at the same time they have all external support to ruin the democracy in the country, so the normal civil society has no power to control this system. So I just want to know, IFS has any types of mechanism to control these types of electoral engineering? Thank you.
Okay, so why don't we just go and start from left to right?
Concerning the question about between Egypt and Turkey, the Turkish experiment is somewhat different. It has similarities to the situation in Egypt, but it is also different from that of Egypt due to the colonial heritage in Egypt. What happened in Egypt is colonialism established a corrupt system that was followed by a military rule that kept the corruption going on until today. In Turkey, the free and fair election was always going on, even during the military coups. After it happens, a transfer election, the new government. That does not happen in Egypt. What is there that we can do? We can do a lot. On the part of Egyptians, we need really to learn how to live together. We need not to allow dictatorship to separate us, divide and conquer, use the same colonial strategy. We need also to be able to come to this equal citizenship understanding, so that all of us can enjoy the democracy and the freedom, not as a group of people against other group of people. If we succeed in doing this, I think we'll be able to do a better job in the coming years. I expect the current regime is not sustainable, economically is not sustainable, politically is not sustainable, so it is not likely to go. What we need to do is, how can we prepare ourselves for the next democratic wave, which I hope will be able to present a better alternatives on all levels for all Egyptians. Thank you.
Thanks. I'll take the second question first. I'm trying to write these down. The electoral engineering. Yeah, I mean, combating the institutions of power to enable a circumstance in which upstart grassroots candidates have a chance at winning is difficult. I mean, it's why I'm far grayer in person than in the picture that Marwan kindly put in the program. It's trying to figure these types of answers out. But in such a regime, the first and foremost thing that often I found is essential is being able to convey information about what's happening. Yes, you're going to have a closed media environment. Yes, you're going to have control of the levers of power. You're going to have control over the political finances. But the first step I've seen in candidates being able to break through this somehow is being able to convey information, share information across the means that are available. And there are many more available now through social media. For example, in Uzbekistan, I'm not holding it up as the best example, but they use Telegram to convey information on a lot of different subjects. When the system is cooked, it's very difficult to change it. But a little piece at a time, once you have recognition of what the problem is, and you have individuals who will stand up for the causes of open and transparent democracy. And by the way, this also includes something I'd mentioned is vitally important, is the existence of domestic monitoring organizations and groups that will hold the government accountable for what it's doing and how it's performing. Once you have these, you can start discussions on the issues that do impact the elections, the electoral legislation, for example, the illicit financing, disinformation, the technology-facilitated gender-based violence, which is part of the information flow. what's keeping women candidates from being more active and successful. But information is probably first and second on quite a long list that I would say. But there's no, shall we say, easy way out, no panacea to solve it. But also civil society, as I mentioned, in education, not accepting the status quo any longer. And we've seen some cases where civil society has played an instrumental role in supporting regime change in the past. And it starts with a very active mindset and the refusal to accept the situation. On the, I think the first question dealt with expectations after 2021. I would say just in short that we have a very evident generational divide in the country where the group that was educated or came up in the Soviet or immediate post-Soviet period feels almost in a way apathetic as to what could happen. And they're quickly becoming more of a minority. You have a group, however, of half of the population that, while at times downtrodden, has far greater expectations for what the country can and should be, both within the region and on the world stage, and they're not accepting that they're not going to get what they want. They're tired of being forced to leave the country in search of work. They want to build a strong community, a strong economy, and a strong country at home. And it's up to, we've said many times, a generational change to really tip the balance. And we have the numbers in Uzbekistan. We'll see if we have the willpower.
We have to wrap it up, so please, like half a minute.
I'd be delighted to engage anybody on the politics of the rule of law, learn from your experiences, or share my data. Anybody who's interested in that topic. Thanks.
Okay, quickly, with regard to the Malaysian political experience, regions matter. Where a country is located does matter. In Southeast Asia, as I noted in my presentation, Indonesia is arguably the most democratic Muslim majority state in the world. In 1998, a military dictatorship was overturned, and since then, the military has not intervened in civilian matters. So I think we need to look at what has happened in Indonesia. It's certainly not a perfect democracy. There are many flaws. Recently, Indonesia's president, there has been a presidential turnover, and it was bloodless, and those defeated accepted the winner. So, so the Indonesian Pancasila democracy. In the case of Malaysia, and I'll end off quickly, Malaysia's constitutional post-colonial state established a democratic constitution. I think Malaysians need to look closely at the post-colonial state constitution, where there are many guarantees to civil liberties, political freedoms, and so on. So in other words, moving forward by looking at the past. In addition to that, Malaysia's national ideology is called the Rukun Negara. In this national ideology, it does categorically state that democracy, liberalism is to be promoted, that Malaysians should, well, unless one is a staunch atheist, but God matters, but it doesn't say Islam or Muslims have to abide by the Quran or Islam, and minorities should not subscribe to their own faith. So it says God, but it doesn't specifically state Islam. So in other words, the freedom of faith, religiosity is all there. So in other words, look back to tradition, to historical tradition in terms of moving forward towards establishing a vibrant Muslim democracy. Thank you.
Thank you.